Well, good morning, everyone. Here we are on a perfect Scottish summer's day. I was actually given another tie this morning. How about that? If I'd had this last night, I would have worn that, but wasn't available at the time. Right, so what we're going to do today is think about what comes after youth and the teenage years. And we'll begin that, though, by picking up with our Proverbs teenager that we met in Proverbs 1-9. So you'll know that Proverbs 1-9 is different to most of the rest of the book of Proverbs. Most of the rest of the book is individual one-verse proverbs, isn't it? And Proverbs 1-9 is not like that. It's much more connected. It's much more continuous. And it actually consists largely of a series of speeches from a father addressing his son. Now, it's not necessarily a literal father. It might be more of a father-mentor figure. But we're in this situation of this father character giving advice to his son. And that's why all through Proverbs 1-9, we keep finding this phrase, my son, hear my instruction, forget not my words. And we looked at one example of that in chapter 1, verses 8 and 10 yesterday. So the advice of a father to a son, and it's interesting that there are actually 10 addresses of the father to the son in Proverbs 1-9. And these are almost like then the 10 commandments of the father as he advises his son. And, you can imagine your situation as a father in which you had one last chance to address your son, perhaps, or, to deliver 10 little pep talks to your son. And how carefully you would think and imagine you were never going to be able to speak to them again, what it would be that you would choose to say. And I think you can see the speeches in Proverbs 1-9 as being a little bit like that. So that's one thing that's going on in Proverbs 1-9. And the other thing that's going on is this constant presentation of the two women and that choice that is there before our young man as to which sort of woman. He's attracted to both women for different reasons, but which one is going to be the one that he will choose and will therefore significantly dictate the rest of the course of his life. And we saw how that choice is presented in every single chapter of Proverbs 1-9. So we got those two things going on in tandem, and yet not quite in the same way. And this is really quite interesting because the 10 speeches of the father to the son, they begin in chapter 1 and chapter 2 and 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And then there aren't any more of them. There are no more occasions in which the father says, my son, hear my words. And the father's voice then grows silent. And so you can imagine this, and I probably should have showed this as a graphic, because here we are in Proverbs, which way around are you? You're over here, right? So Proverbs 1 here, and we're going to 9 down here. So we start with the father as the dominant character addressing the son, but as we go through Proverbs 1-9, his voice becomes less, and it gradually disappears, so that he's not referred to at all in Proverbs 8 and 9. In contrast, the character of the two women, it begins in Proverbs 1, but it's not dominant, and the address on the women grows and grows and grows until chapters 7, 8, and 9. There's nothing but the women who are presented before our young man, and he has to make his choice. And what I think is interesting about that is that that's exactly what most men's lives look like, or it's how we develop, because of course, when we're at home being brought up, our dad's voice is quite important to us. In fact, we can't get away from it, much as we might like to at some points. The advice of our father, the instruction, the commands of our father are there in our ears every day. But as we develop as a teenager, we gradually learn more and more independence, don't we? And the voice of our father starts to become just one of the many voices that we hear in our ears. And there's a certain point when I become my own man. And each of us, we become our own person. And the father's opportunity is over. Of course, it's not completely over. I still have a relationship with my father, and you still do with yours, perhaps. And you may well talk to them and ask them for advice. I'm sure you do if your father is still alive. But you get the point that the father's ability to influence and certainly to command the son gets less and less as the child ages and approaches adulthood. And that is reflected, mirrored precisely in Proverbs 1-9. In contrast, of course, as the man increasingly begins to consider women and dating and ultimately marriage, the influence of the woman that he will choose is going to become increasingly more important until that's going to become the biggest human influence in his life, isn't it? Ultimately, your choice of marriage partner will be exactly that. So it's absolutely right that by the time we get to Proverbs 7, 8, and 9, the whole thing is taken up by what is your choice, which woman is it that you will choose, and that's not just about who will you marry, but it's also about which path will you follow. Will you follow the path of God or the path of sin? So that's how it is in our lives as we grow up and as we begin now to embark on adulthood. But we might still have the question, well, what does happen in the end? What does happen to our young man who listened to all the advice of his father in those first 7 chapters and who had this acute choice presented before him? What choice did he make? Well, we've each of us got to make that choice, whether we're male or female. But there's a wonderful way in which the book of Proverbs ends and reprises this theme. Because if we go to Proverbs 31, you'll know that it's not a father there that speaks, is it? The book doesn't end with a father. It doesn't, in fact, end with a man. It starts to end in Proverbs 31 and verse 1 with the words of Lemuel, but we are actually soon told that they're actually not the words of Lemuel, they're the words that his mother taught him. So the book begins with the words of a father and it ends with the words of a mother, doesn't it? So we've got the words of Lemuel, which kind of remind us of some of the things that Proverbs 1-9 were about. But of course, the book closes not with that, but with the amazing acrostic of the virtuous woman. So who is she? Well, she's several different things. She is this idealization of what the perfect wife would be like, isn't she? But she's not just that. She's also a reprise of the Lady Wisdom figure, this personification of wisdom from earlier in the book. And we see her again in all her splendor, in all her diverse activities, in all the things that she can do in someone's household. Because as we grow up and leave our teenage years behind, and for most of us marry and settle down and establish our family, and we leave our father and mother and we cleave to our wives, that's exactly what we'll be doing. We'll be setting up a household. And that's what this talk is all about. And the woman is going to be absolutely crucial in building that household, in creating and enabling that household to be all that it can be. And we see the virtuous woman doing exactly that with industry, with diligence, with all those virtues that she possesses. And one of the things that it says about her is, it's not about the man, is it? It's about her. But just in passing, it talks about how her husband is known in the gates, and he's become an elder now of the community. And so what we've got in the book is the life cycle of this man who began as a son, listening to the voice of his father, but by the end of the book has become an elder in his community, a pillar of his society. And but the book closes not by focusing on him, but by focusing on her. And she then is the perfect wife for him, and she speaks not just of what wives can be in all of our families, but also of what wisdom can be if it is in the heart of our houses. So the book of Proverbs then does describe this growing up process and how it can have this wonderful conclusion in a family established, a husband and a wife, and the husband's responsibilities and the larger community, and all the activities that the wife is engaged in both within the home and outside the home, but how it's all focused on her household and on caring for the poor and the sick and so forth. It's an absolutely delightful picture. Let's go to another passage that we were always going to go there, weren't we? It's Ephesians chapter 4. We've talked, I think, in every talk about how this metaphor of growth from conception through to the weaned child, the adolescent, the young man or woman, the family man or woman, it's all about growth. Growth is the central metaphor, and perhaps it's Ephesians 4 more than any other passage that draws out that parable and what it is that we're meant to be growing into. Ephesians 4 and verse 13. So God has given us all these different blessings, skills, roles, opportunities. We each come as individuals with our own unique brains and unique abilities and talents, and we bring them before the Lord till we all come, Ephesians 4 and verse 13, in the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, unto a perfect man, or unto a mature person. That's what we're thinking about in today's session, what we should be as mature people. To a perfect man, a mature person, a full, a complete person, not an empty person who's just still really a child in large form, but is now what a person is supposed to be. We come to that unto the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. And what speaks to me powerfully there is the redundancy in it. And it's not redundancy, of course. Every word is there precisely. But you could take any one of those words out and it would still make sense, wouldn't it? Until we all come unto the measure of Christ, until we all come unto the stature of Christ, until we all come unto the fullness of Christ. But Paul doesn't just use one word. He doesn't just use two words. He uses all three of these terms. It would have been enough merely to have said, until we all come to a mature person like Christ. But no, until we come to a mature person, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. So we're measuring ourselves, we're comparing ourselves against Christ, to reach the height that he has reached, to achieve the fullness, the mass, the substance, the significance, the weight of what he achieved in his life, that our lives may be as meaningful as his because they are associated with his life and because we have been baptized and buried into the likeness of his death and raised with the likeness of his resurrection. So there's this sense then of each of us stretching ourselves out, isn't there, to the fullest extent that we possibly can, of not being content with where we are, but saying, I can be more. I can be more like Christ than I currently am. My spirituality can be higher. There can be more substance to my life than there currently is. There's still this potential for growth, no matter how old we are and where we are in this developmental process. That we be henceforth no more children tossed to and fro and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by the sleight of man and cunning craftiness whereby they lie in wait to be deceived, but speaking the truth in love may grow up in him in all things, which is the head, even Christ. So, growing up in all things, that then is another challenge, isn't it? Because, most of us are good at some things and not so good at other things. But the wonder of Christ is his completeness as a person, the complete set of virtues that he possessed. And for all of us, there are areas of strength and there are areas of lesser strength, as the people or human resources department likes to call it. There are areas for us still to focus on until we grow up in all things into the head. And isn't that just how it is? Because when a baby is born, of course, it has this enormous head, doesn't it? Relative to the size of its body. And it's, your head when you're born is apparently about 2 centimeters, the circumference of your head is about 2 centimeters bigger than the circumference of your chest. And it's a good thing it doesn't stay like that, isn't it? We'd all look rather weird and probably topple over all the time. So the head is much bigger. The baby's head is about 25% of the size of the full-sized head, whereas the body is only about 5% of the size of the full-sized thing. So by a factor of 5 then, the head is bigger than the body relative to how it would be in an adult. So when he says growing up into the head, that's absolutely right, isn't it? That is what happens in human development. The rest of our bodies have to catch up with the head. Now in our case, of course, the head is still growing, but at it needs much less growth than the rest of our bodies do. But in Christ's case, he is the perfect head. He has learned that obedience by the things that he suffered, and he is that perfect man, that perfect head, and now it's our job to catch up with him as far as we possibly can, he who is our forerunner. Well, Paul's not finished with the metaphor just yet, but verse 16, from whom, from Christ, the whole body, fitly framed together and connected by that which every joint supplieth, according to the effectual working in the measure of every part, makes increase of the body unto the edifying of itself in love. So lots of words in there, in that verse, but it's all about emphasizing the connectedness, the interconnectedness of a human body, in which for the body to work at its optimum, every part is needed, and every part has a function. Now, we've thought about this passage so far in the context of what we each need to achieve, the growth that we must each strive for to be mature men and women in Christ, that life's work in which we're engaged with God's help. And I think there is a level at which that is what the passage is about, but it's also about more than that, isn't it? Because the image of a body and a head is not just, or perhaps even primarily, about the individual. It's about the ecclesia. It's about Christ and the ecclesia. And it's about the way in which we must all together strive for this growth. And that which every part supplies and is intimately interconnected, that's what we have to be. Like joints and ligaments connected. And one bit, my fingers will only move if they're connected, by bones and tendons and by nerves and by a message from the brain that tells them what to do. Connection is intrinsic, isn't it, to the functioning of a human body. And that's how it must be for us in our individual ecclesias and for us as a wider community and body in the Lord Jesus Christ. So there's the overall picture then of how we must develop and how the ecclesia must develop. Let's now go into some further thoughts about what happens at the literal level when we become adults. And for most of us, as I've said, so of course there is a particular calling for those who do not marry, and for those who do not have children. And I think the scriptures speak about those things. Obviously, because of time restrictions, I'm going to speak about what is more typical, and I'm going to talk about the family. And so for most of us, then, as we pass now into our 20s or 30s, our own identity has largely been formed. And that was what the teenage growing up process was about. It was about working out who we are. And by now, largely we know who we are and who we want to be, and we have set a course. And we leave our father and mother, and we cleave to our wife or to our husband, and we form this new unit, this household. And so what this stage of life is about then, up to now, it's all been self-focused, hasn't it? It's been about the conception of this new creature living inside us. It's been about the birth of a baby, and of course the baby has its urgent needs, and the teenage years are about growing up as your own person, knowing who you want to be and sorting that out and making your choices. But when we go into family life and into adulthood, it's not just about me anymore, is it? It's about now interconnectedness with others. It's about self-sacrifice and working out how to be interrelated to other people, how to be part of a bigger unit, learning mutual interdependence. And other people now start to become dependent on us. So there's a sense in which a wife is dependent on her husband, and a sense in which the husband is dependent on the wife for the things that they each bring to the marriage and that they each provide. And of course, then if children come along, then they too become our dependents. So that's interesting. That's a new stage, isn't it? And it's difficult. It seems to me that you don't really realize quite how selfish you are until you get married. And then there's another person to consider, isn't there? And of course, you can go on your own merry way and say, well, I'm just going to carry on just as I was before and do what I want to do. Well, that marriage will not be a successful one, will it? As we all know. We know where that is heading if that's our attitude. And so we learn so much then about what spirituality means in giving. In saying, well, I know I want to do this, but there's another perspective to consider. There's what you would like to do. And there's what's best for our new unit, whether that's the husband and wife or whether it's a larger family with children. And so I don't know if this was certainly my experience of that stage of, this is a bit of an eye-opener about, considering others and considering their needs, and just how obsessed with my own interests I'd been able to be as a single person, and how that had to change. So then you learn that, and we had roughly about 5 years of marriage before we had the children. And then, of course, when the children come along, then that's a whole new level again, isn't it? You thought, well, I thought I'd got this thing about not being so selfish. I thought I'd become quite selfless. Not so good. Now, and of course, particularly in those early years of parenting, the children's needs are so constant and so desperate, aren't they? And there is no putting them off. They have to be provided for and given those things and that attention that they need. So that again then becomes another massive lesson in realizing that it's not just about me. I am not the center of the universe that I'd thought that I was. And that then can help us realize about God's wider purpose, because it's not just about my family either, is it? Or about your family and what your family or my family might want to do. Because God's got a whole world of families, and actually it's Him, it's He who is the center, and not any of us or any of our families. Well, what about what about those specific responsibilities in the family? Of course, the family needs an identity. It needs to know what kind of a family it is, doesn't it? And Joshua provides a nice example of that when he says, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And the father in particular then, if we think about what are the metaphors or what even are the titles of God, well, when we come to the New Testament, Father, the title of Father is dominant. What is a father like? How does a child know what a father is like? If God is a father, what does that mean to a child? Well, it means whatever the child's father is like, doesn't it? First of all, that's the first that a child is going to see about what a father is like. So what kind of a father are you going to be, and am I going to be in my family? Because that is the lens through which the scriptures encourage children to see God. So that the father's provision and the father's love and the father's example stand for, in some degree, what God himself is like. And so gone must be all hypocrisy. And what about the mother? Well, why don't we bring this together by having a look at Psalm 128? Because what we've got in here is a little picture of a family. Beautiful psalm. Just a short one. And it moves in concentric circles. And again, it starts off by assuming, it starts off with the man, and it builds out from there. So again, a bit like we did in Proverbs, we have to imagine ourselves as a male, and then we see things in relation to that in the psalm. But again, in doing that, that doesn't prevent us from seeing from a divine perspective, as the psalm speaks to us here, how all the components of the family fit together. Blessed is everyone that fears the Lord, that walks in his ways. For thou shalt eat the labor of thine hands. Happy shalt thou be, and it shall be well with thee. So here we are then as a male reading this psalm, and we know that we're male because it's going to talk about our wife in a minute. So that's why we've started with that presumption. So what I need to do, first of all, is I need to fear the Lord. That's what comes first. And that's exactly where Proverbs begins also, isn't it? With that very same concept. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Blessed is everyone that fears the Lord, that walks in his ways. So that's my responsibility then as father in my house, that I should fear the Lord and that I should walk in his ways. And if I do that, God will bless me. And I will eat the labor of my hands. I will be happy, and it will be well with me. And so there's a reminder there of Genesis and what God said to Adam in the garden about the work that he had to take on and the labor that would be and the food that would arise from that. So there is the man fulfilling those commandments that were given back in Genesis 3 rather. I think I might have said Genesis 1. Okay, so there's the man. What about the wife then? Well, here she is in verse 3. Thy wife shall be as a fruitful vine by the sides of thy house. And you probably know that's not a good translation. Like, your wife will be a fruitful vine in the very heart of your house. So you picture your house, and there is there right in the middle of it this fruitful vine. And I once went to a brother's house in California, in San Diego, and his house was circular. And I never saw this illustrated more practically than in this brother's house. He had this circular house, and in the middle of the house was this enormous tree trunk that went right up to the roof, and that supported the whole structure. The thing was a little bit like a sort of a teepee arrangement. And if you took that central tree out of the house, the whole thing would collapse, and there would be no house and no household, literally, for that brother. And the wife is like that. She's like this fruit-producing tree. And we talked a couple of days back, didn't we, about man as being the bringer of death and the woman being the bringer of life, of nourishment, of sustenance, of comfort in the family. And here she is at the very center of it, at the heart of the house, like a fruitful vine. And of course, vines bring forth grapes, which bring forth wine, which makes glad the heart of man. And that little metaphor then of the vine and the wine speaks of the blessings of marriage that a husband and wife share. And that speaks of physical blessings, and it speaks of spiritual blessings. It speaks of the companionship that they share, which is what a marriage should be like, shouldn't it? It should be about sharing on all those levels: physical, emotional, practical, spiritual. And there is the wife. And then we continue to move out then in these concentric circles. Thy children shall be like olive plants round about thy table. So the children then are around. So the husband and the wife are there in the middle, because the man's going to be by his wife, isn't he? And there are the children. And the children, of course, are this wonderful blessing. I sort of mentioned this the other day, but we can tend to think of our children as liabilities rather than assets. There's no doubt about what the right way of looking at it is from God's perspective. It may be a nuisance to us at the time. They may, from time to time, they may stop us doing things that we might otherwise have wished to do. But they are assets. They are like olive plants. And of course, olives were, just like vines, were central. This is all an agricultural metaphor, isn't it? Just like the man is there working in the fields to produce his fruit so that the family could eat. Within the home too, fruit is being produced. There is fruitfulness towards God. Just as there's literal fruitfulness produced in the fields and on the dinner table, so there's this spiritual fruit that's produced in the family, and not just from the father and the mother, but by the children as well. The children are expected to be productive. So the children are not just sat in some other room on an electronic device, are they? Which, comes back to what Matt was talking about in the previous. This is another challenge. This is a challenge of parenting specifically, and about controlling that aspect. And we struggle with it. I certainly haven't got this right. And there are no absolute right answers to it, and I was very conscious in Matt's talk of this modern challenge that we have to deal with. But the picture that we've got here is certainly not of a child that is just sort of receiving and doing its thing. These are children which are contributing and are themselves bringing forth fruit, which will be a positive for the whole family. Behold that thus shall the man be blessed that fears the Lord. You see how it wraps up now from what it said in verse 1. Blessed is everyone that fears the Lord. If you have this kind of family, then you will be truly blessed. So it's our job to try to create that, isn't it? Wherever we know, whether we're the children, to have this as some kind of a vision, and it's not beyond the comprehension of a child, that is it. For the wife to have that kind of a vision for herself as that provider of that fruitfulness and nourishment for the family, and for the husband as well, as fearing the Lord and leading the family towards God's kingdom. And so the psalm concludes with these two verses of blessing. The Lord shall bless thee out of Zion, and thou shalt see the good of Jerusalem all the days of thy life. Yea, thou shalt see thy children's children, and peace upon Israel. Do you see? So the Lord's blessing comes from Zion, and we'll see it. And there's three places where we'll see it. Thou shalt see the good of Jerusalem all the days of thy life. Thou shalt see thy children's children, and thou shalt see peace upon Israel. And we've got like a little sandwich there, haven't we? And we've got, you'll see Jerusalem, you'll see your grandchildren, and you'll see peace upon Israel. Do you see where the grandchildren are? They're enclosed, they're wrapped up, aren't they, in the blessings of Israel. They're wrapped up in the hope of Israel. And if our families have that hope of Israel, then our children will be safe. And our children's children will be safe. And what greater blessing could there be than that? It's just a short psalm, but it's absolutely beautiful in this vision that it has for the family. I'd like to spend a couple of minutes thinking about the particular pressures that come with, because these are hard years, aren't they? These years with children at home and all the responsibilities that we have in life, the pressures of life. It can feel sometimes, can't it, that and that's why I've called this the balancing act, because there are so many things demanding our time, and there are other things that don't demand our time, but which we would really like to spend our time doing. All those distractions and opportunities that modern life provides us with. And even those things that, ought to be the fun things that we would enjoy doing, can actually start to feel like burdens around us because, we want to do them, but we can't ever get at them, and then they themselves, that itself becomes an irritation. And it can feel like everybody wants a piece of us sometimes. So we've got our career and the demands that has, the demands of our family, the demands, in quotes, of our hobbies, ecclesial demands upon us as citizens, as neighbors in our immediate communities. And each of us has all these different aspects of our calling. We're to be a disciple. We're to be a worker, perhaps, in the commercial sense. We're to be providers. We're to be lovers. We're to be parents. We're to be friends. We're to be dishwashers. We're to be accountants. We're to be bureaucrats. All of these aspects, aren't there, to life? And sometimes it just feels like I can't cope with all the... Will you just go away? All those responsibilities and demands upon us. And it's tough. It's tough to cope with that. Life is much more complex than it ever was, isn't it? With all those different aspects. And even as it's brought us opportunity and brought us freedom, it has enslaved us in yet another way. And so we've got stress as this massive pressure upon us. So what is the answer? Well, I think Brother Matt's already given us the answer, hasn't he, in our first session. And I think there's nothing I can say that would be more eloquent than what he's already said about the significance of being still and knowing that he is God. And it sounds like all three of us now then have talked about this, Brother Joe as well, and about how important it is. That we don't become resentful of whoever it is or whatever it is that demands our time. So we've got to prioritize, haven't we? We've got to be alert to the dangers. I mean, I've talked about the negative side of it, how it can all feel to be too much. And for times when it's like that, well, we need to be able to be calm and to be still. We need to be able to say, well, what are the things that are really important? And let me make sure I discharge those properly. And then let me worry about the other things in due course. Let me take one day at a time and consider today's evil as sufficient for itself. But there's another danger too, and that it's that we become preoccupied in what this world has to offer and in all the busyness of those things, that we disappear into our careers, that our sense of competitiveness and drive finds its outlet in the workplace, and that we allow that to dominate and dictate the course of our lives, and everything else has to get squeezed around that. And that isn't right, because God comes first and is the one who is the center of our lives, and our responsibilities to him are those which come first. When our career takes over, that can be a form of self-importance. It can be a form of selfishness and self-absorption that takes us away from our responsibilities towards our family. There can be a danger of being caught up in minutiae, can't there? In things which are not really why we're here, and not really what it's important for us to do. And for me personally, I found it helpful just to realize that there is not enough time to do everything that I would like to do. And it sounds a very basic and obvious thing to say, doesn't it? But for me, before I said that to myself, there was a lot of frustration about, why can't I do these things, or why is there no time to do this? But actually, if the important things are in life, then it doesn't really matter whether I've got time to pursue everything that I might like to pursue. I'll be content in whatsoever state I am with the things that God has given me, and I'll make sure I really enjoy and appreciate those things and thank God for them. There's also a danger in becoming too absorbed by the family and the children. And although that sounds, well, surely we should be absorbed by that. Yes, we should, but not to the point of losing sight of God. And I think there's particularly a danger of the family coming to revolve around the children. The family doesn't revolve around the children, does it? The family revolves around God. And what we saw in Psalm 128 was, it began with the perspective of the husband and his wife in the very heart of the house. And the children were round about like olive plants. And then there was the wider community of Israel and the children's children. So that's how it is. And the husband and the wife are there together before the children are born, and they will be there after the children have gone. So my point here is not that we should ignore the children and the child needs a drink and say, well, sorry, because I'm having my drink first. I don't mean that. But I think there can be a tendency, and modern society, particularly in America, I felt when we lived there, it was very much focused on the children's wants, perhaps, rather than the children's needs come first, and everything else is subservient to that. That's not the biblical model of a family, is it? It's God, and it's the husband and wife who form the core of what the family is, and it's their responsibility to consider the needs of everyone in the family and to make sure that the whole family, with the wife helping the husband in his responsibilities as spiritual head, to pull together towards God's kingdom. So then, we've talked about two particular dangers from this time in the heat of the sun. When our careers perhaps demand much of us, when we have the demands of home and ecclesia pressing in upon us. There are two particular dangers of that time, and it seems to me, and one of them is the danger of self-sufficiency, that I'm just too busy with all the things that I'm doing in my family, and that God is somehow forgotten, or that I think that, if I just work harder, or if I just put more into it, we can achieve what needs to be achieved. We can do it. That it's by my own strength I can be thus and so. And yet, if we again imagine the spectrum of the life cycle, we know, of course, that, well, I might be able to now, in my 30s or in my 40s, but pretty soon, I'm not going to be as strong as I was. And I'm not going to be able to do everything that I wanted to do. And I'm going to find that I'm not actually as smart as I thought I was either. So that illusion of self-sufficiency, if we have it, needs to go. So that's one danger. And then the other danger then is this danger of preoccupation, that we're just so busy at this time in our lives that we don't take time to prioritize properly and to be with our God and to set our course as we should. I was going to conclude with two things. We only have time for one of them. And so I do just want to say a few words about the so-called midlife crisis. So what is that all about? I don't know whether you've had one. I'm not sure whether I have or not. I suppose I've had something that's sort of slightly resembled it. But what is it about? Well, I think it is about standing in the middle of the stage and saying, well, that was quite good up to this point, wasn't it? It was a lot of fun. We did a lot of really interesting things. And, got married. That was wonderful. We had children. Look how great they're doing. Things have gone quite well in my we go on some nice holidays. Busy in the ecclesia. This might be what we might look around and say this. And then we look forward and say, that's maybe not looking so good when I think about what now lies ahead. And we realize, of course, that we are now going grey, that we're not now as strong as we used to be or as fast as we used to be, that our memory doesn't work as much as effectively as it used to. And perhaps we reach a point in our careers where we realize that actually I'm never going to make CEO, if that was my ambition, or I'm probably not going to be getting another significant promotion now beyond where I am. It seemed like my career was going up, and now, well, it's just not. And actually now I'm the one who's at risk, because of the salary that I'm paid relative to the young guys. And was that it then? Was that the best that life had to offer? And is there a way in which I can feel young and cool again, perhaps? Is there a way that I can feel alive by going bungee jumping or whatever it might be, buying a Harley Davidson? I don't know. So these are the things that people might, these are the sort of caricatures, aren't they, of let me feel alive, please, as I stand here and think, is that it? Is that the best that life can offer? So we may think some of those thoughts, but of course, if we remember the guidance of Ecclesiastes, we would have always had this perspective that life was going to take this shape. And we would know that life, wonderful as it is, and so richly God has blessed us, but that it has these limits around it. And therefore, we should never have projected onto life any more than it could be. This is not the end, is it? As we said in our first talk, this isn't what life is all about. This is the building site for the building that God is creating. And therefore, I don't need to find meaning by buying a Porsche or skydiving or whatever it is, because my life already had meaning, and it will continue to have meaning through all the changing scenes in life. In trouble and in joy, the praises of my God shall still my heart and tongue employ. And though my body may begin to decline, and now we get into tomorrow's considerations, the spiritual man or woman that is growing within will not, because that man is renewed every day. Would you bow your heads, please, and we'll close with prayer. Almighty Lord God, we thank you for more time to reflect on our days and our ways. And for those of us who are in that stage of life where life does seem incredibly busy, where there are all these pressures and demands, we ask that you would bless us, that you would calm us and encourage us, that you would help us to see the things which truly matter and to structure our lives around those things. We know that you are a kind God and that you have allowed us to enjoy many other things that are not important in a deep sense, but which are wonderful blessings from you, and we thank you for those opportunities also. We pray that you will help us in our families, that we will speak kindly to one another as wife to husband and husband to wife, that we will put your ways at the heart of our families, and that we will, in the wisest and most engaging way, teach our children to love your ways. In Jesus' name we offer this prayer. Amen.